The blood drained from Susannah Morrison's face as Judge Cornelius Thatcher leaned back in his leather chair and named his price for dismissing the charges against her. And the sum he demanded might as well have been all the gold in California for how impossible it was to obtain. She stood in the private chambers of the Wheatland, Wyoming courthouse on a sweltering afternoon in July of 1883, her worn cotton dress clinging to her back, and watched the judge's thick fingers drum against the mahogany desk, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for her answer. The charges were fabricated, every single one of them, concocted by Luther Haynes, who wanted her family's land along the creek where the sweetest grazing grass grew thick and green even in the driest summers. But the judge did not care about truth or justice, only about the weight of coins in his pockets. $2,000, Miss Morrison, Judge Thatcher repeated, his jowls quivering as he spoke. That is what it will cost for these unfortunate charges to disappear from my docket. Otherwise, I am afraid the trial will proceed, and given the evidence Mr. Haynes has provided, well, I cannot imagine the verdict will be in your favor. Susannah's hands trembled at her sides. $2,000. Her father had left her the ranch when he died 2 years ago, but between the drought last summer and the harsh winter that followed, she had barely scraped together enough to keep her small herd fed and the ranch hands paid. She had perhaps $300 to her name, and that was meant to last through the next cattle drive in September. Her mother had passed when Susannah was only 16, leaving her to manage the household even before her father's death made her sole proprietor of the Morrison Ranch. At 23 years old, she had fought tooth and nail to keep that land, to prove she could run it as well as any man. And now this corrupt judge threatened to take it all away with a single swing of his gavel. I do not have that kind of money, Susannah said, forcing her voice to remain steady even as panic clawed at her throat. You know I do not. Everyone in this town knows the Morrison Ranch has been struggling. Then I suggest you find a way to acquire it, Judge Thatcher said, his pale eyes cold and calculating. You have until tomorrow morning when court convenes at 9 o'clock. If you cannot pay, then we proceed to trial, and I assure you, Miss Morrison, the outcome will not be pleasant. Mr. Haynes has witnesses prepared to testify that you deliberately diverted water from the shared creek, that you allowed your cattle to destroy his fences, that you have been nothing but a nuisance since your father passed and left a woman in charge of a man's enterprise. The words stung because Susannah knew exactly what they implied, that she was unfit, that she was incapable, that she should have sold the ranch or married someone to run it properly. She had refused every offer, every suggestion. Every man who came sniffing around thinking a widow's daughter would be desperate enough to accept whatever scraps of affection they offered in exchange for her land. The Morrison Ranch was hers, bought with her father's sweat and blood, and she would die before she let Luther Haynes or anyone else steal it from her. This is not justice, Susannah said, her voice breaking despite her efforts. You know these charges are false. You know Luther Haynes wants my land, and you are helping him take it. Careful, Miss Morrison, Judge Thatcher warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. Accusations against an officer of the court can result in additional charges. I would hate to add contempt to your growing list of offenses. Susannah bit her tongue hard enough to taste copper. There was no point in arguing further. The judge had made his position clear, and she had no power to change it. She turned and walked out of his chambers, her boots echoing against the wooden floorboards of the courthouse, and stepped into the blazing afternoon sun that turned the dusty streets of Wheatland into shimmering waves of heat. The town was small but prosperous, situated along the railroad line that brought cattle buyers and settlers heading further west. False-fronted buildings lined Main Street, their painted signs advertising everything from dry goods to whiskey to telegrams sent anywhere in the country for a reasonable fee. Susannah walked past the general store where Mrs. Chen was sweeping the front steps, past the saloon where piano music tinkled through the swinging doors even at this early hour, past the bank where she knew the manager would laugh in her face if she asked for a loan without collateral. She had no options. No family to turn to, no friends wealthy enough to lend her such an enormous sum, no hidden cache of gold buried beneath her floorboards. Tomorrow morning, she would stand before Judge Thatcher in open court, unable to pay his bribe, and he would rule against her. Luther Haynes would claim her land, probably for a fraction of its worth, and she would be left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter taste of injustice. Susannah was so lost in her despair that she nearly collided with the man standing outside the boarding house at the end of Main Street. She looked up, an apology already forming on her lips, and found herself staring into eyes the color of rain clouds over the mountains. He was tall, built lean and strong like a man who spent his days in the saddle, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his dusty shirt and a shadow of stubble across his jaw. His hat was pushed back on his head, and a bandana hung loose around his neck. Something in his expression made her think he had been waiting, though for what or whom she could not say. "Pardon me," Susannah said, stepping around him. "You are Susannah Morrison," the man said, and it was not a question. Susannah froze, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. She turned back slowly, studying him with new wariness. He did not look like one of Luther Haynes's men. They were rough and cruel with cold eyes and quick tempers. This man had a different quality about him, something steady and calm like deep water. "Who are you?" she asked. "My name is Ryder Ross," he said, and his voice was low and warm like whiskey on a cold night. "I have been working at the Triple Bar Ranch for the past month, but I heard about your situation in town today, about the charges, about the judge." Susannah's stomach twisted. Of course word had spread. Wheatland was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and a young woman facing criminal charges was too delicious a piece of gossip to keep quiet. She could imagine the whispers over dinner tables, the knowing looks exchanged in the general store, the way people would cross the street to avoid her once Judge Thatcher declared her guilty. "Then, you know there is nothing to be done," Susannah said bitterly. "The judge has made his decision, and I cannot afford to change his mind." "I know Judge Thatcher is as crooked as a dog's hind leg," Ryder said, and the bluntness of his words startled a short laugh from Susannah despite everything. "I know Luther Haynes has been trying to force you off your land for months, and I know you have been fighting him alone." "What does it matter to you?" Susannah asked, though something warm and fragile was beginning to kindle in her chest. Hope, maybe, though she barely dared name it. "Because I have seen this before," Ryder said, his jaw tightening. "In Texas, in Colorado, in every town where men with money think they can take whatever they want from people with less. My father lost his ranch to a man like Luther Haynes when I was 15 years old. Lost everything because he could not afford to fight back, could not afford the lawyers or the bribes or whatever else it took to stand up to someone with power. He died 6 months later, and my mother followed him within the year. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to stop it from happening to someone else, I would." Susannah's throat tightened with emotion. She searched Ryder's face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint that this was some new scheme to take advantage of her desperation. But all she saw was sincerity, fierce and burning, and something else she could not quite name, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. "How?" she whispered. "How can you possibly stop this? The trial is tomorrow morning. The judge will not listen to reason, and I have no way to pay what he demands." "You do not pay bribes," Ryder said flatly. "You expose them. You make sure everyone in that courtroom knows exactly what Judge Thatcher is doing, and you make it impossible for him to rule against you without revealing himself as the corrupt snake he is." "He will have me thrown out for contempt," Susannah protested. "Or worse. And even if I speak up, who will believe me? A woman accused of crimes against one of the wealthiest men in the county." "They will believe you if you have proof," Ryder said, "and witnesses, and someone willing to stand beside you when you face that judge tomorrow." Susannah's heart was racing now, her mind spinning with possibilities and dangers. It was a wild plan, reckless and dangerous, and it might very well make everything worse. But what choice did she have? If she did nothing, she would lose everything anyway. At least this way she would go down fighting. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. "You do not even know me." Ryder was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made heat rise in her cheeks. "Maybe I want to," he said finally. "Maybe I am tired of watching good people lose to bad ones. Or maybe I just think you deserve someone in your corner for once." The words hit Susannah like a physical blow, not because they were harsh but because they were kind, and kindness had been in short supply for so long. She blinked hard against the sudden sting of tears and nodded, not trusting her voice. "Tell me what to do," she said. They spent the rest of the afternoon and long into the evening planning. Ryder had a sharp mind for strategy, and he laid out their approach with the precision of a general preparing for battle. First, they needed witnesses who could testify not about the false charges Luther Haynes had brought, but about Judge Thatcher's corruption. Ryder knew a rancher named Tom Bellamy, who had been forced to pay the judge $300 to avoid jail time for a crime he did not commit. He knew a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who had lost custody of her own children when she refused to sell her property to an associate of the judge. He knew a dozen small injustices that had accumulated over the years, each one dismissed or ignored because no one had the courage or resources to challenge the man in the black robes. "Will they speak up?" Susannah asked doubtfully as they sat in the back corner of the boarding house dining room, their heads bent close over cups of coffee that had long since gone cold. "If they were too afraid before, why would they risk it now?" "Because they will not be alone," Ryder said. "One person speaking up is easy to silence. A dozen people, all telling the same story, all demanding justice, that is harder to ignore. And if we do it in open court with the whole town watching, Judge Thatcher cannot make you all disappear." It was risky. It was potentially disastrous. But it was also the first real plan Susannah had heard that did not involve her surrendering everything she had worked for, and she clung to it like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. "What about Luther Haynes?" she asked. "He will not take this lying down." "Let me worry about Haynes," Ryder said, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I have dealt with men like him before." They talked until the dining room closed and the proprietor politely but firmly suggested they take their business elsewhere. Ryder walked Susannah back to where her horse was tied outside the courthouse, and the night air was finally cool after the brutal heat of the day. Crickets sang in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew mournfully. "Thank you," Susannah said, turning to face Ryder in the darkness. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across his features and making him look almost unreal, like something from a dream. "I do not know why you are doing this, but thank you." "You do not need to thank me yet," Ryder said. "Tomorrow is when the real fight begins. Even so, Susannah said. She reached out and touched his hand just briefly, her fingers brushing against his calloused palm. The contact sent a jolt through her, electric and startling, and she pulled back quickly. I have been alone for a long time. It means something to have someone willing to stand with me. Ryder caught her hand before she could withdraw completely, his fingers closing gently around hers. You are not alone anymore, he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. Not if I have anything to say about it. They stood like that for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, the air between them charged with something Susannah could not name but felt all the way to her bones. Then Ryder released her hand and stepped back, clearing his throat. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow will be a long day. Susannah nodded and mounted her horse, her hand still tingling where Ryder had touched it. She rode back to her ranch in the moonlight, and for the first time in weeks, the heavy weight of despair had lifted just enough for her to breathe. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the sun already burning by the time Susannah rode back into Wheatland. She had dressed in her best dress, a dark blue calico that her mother had made years ago, and she had pinned her honey-colored hair into a neat bun at the base of her neck. She wanted to look respectable, composed, like a woman who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear, even though her stomach was churning with nerves. The courthouse was already crowded when she arrived. Word had spread about the trial, and it seemed half the town had turned out to watch the spectacle of Susannah Morrison's downfall. She recognized faces from church, from the general store, from years of living in this community, and she wondered how many of them believed she was guilty, how many of them would celebrate when Judge Thatcher ruled against her. Luther Haynes stood near the front of the courtroom, a tall man with iron-gray hair and a face like carved granite. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and he radiated the confidence of someone who had never lost anything he set his mind to taking. When he saw Susannah, his thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it had held any warmth. Susannah forced herself to meet his gaze and not look away. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Then Ryder walked through the courthouse doors, and the breath left Susannah's lungs in a rush. He had cleaned up since last night, his dark hair combed back and his jaw freshly shaved. He wore a clean shirt and a leather vest, and his hat was in his hands. But it was the look in his eyes that steadied her, that fierce determination that said he was ready for whatever came next. He was not alone. Behind him came Tom Bellamy, a stocky rancher with a weathered face and honest eyes. Behind Tom came Mrs. Patterson, a thin woman in a faded black dress who held her head high despite the whispers that followed her. Behind them came others, men and women Susannah recognized from around town, all of them walking with purpose into the courtroom. Luther Haynes's confidence flickered, just for a moment, and Susannah felt a savage satisfaction at the sight. All rise for the Honorable Judge Cornelius Thatcher, the bailiff called, and the courtroom rustled to its feet. Judge Thatcher swept in wearing his black robes, his expression already smug as he took his seat behind the bench. He banged his gavel once, and the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. We are here today to address the charges brought by Mr. Luther Haynes against Miss Susannah Morrison, Judge Thatcher intoned, his voice carrying the false gravity of someone play-acting at justice. Miss Morrison, you stand accused of deliberate destruction of property, theft of water rights, and willful trespass. How do you plead? Susannah stood, her legs shaking but her voice clear. Not guilty, Your Honor. Very well, Judge Thatcher said, and he looked almost bored. Mr. Haynes, present your evidence. Luther Haynes called his first witness, a ranch hand who testified that he had seen Susannah's cattle breaking through fences onto Haynes's property. He spoke smoothly, confidently, and Susannah knew the man was lying through his teeth, but she had no way to prove it. Her lawyer, a nervous young man named Peter Grant who had only been practicing for 2 years, did his best to cross-examine, but the witness held firm to his story. The second witness was even worse. A surveyor who claimed that Susannah had illegally diverted water from the shared creek, depriving Haynes's cattle of their rightful access. Again, it was a lie, but it was a lie backed by official-looking documents and confident testimony. By the time Luther Haynes rested his case, Susannah felt sick. The evidence was all fabricated, but it was presented so professionally, so convincingly, that she could see doubt beginning to creep into the faces of the townspeople watching. Maybe they were starting to believe she really had done these things. Maybe they thought she was just a foolish woman who had gotten in over her head trying to run a ranch alone. "Miss Morrison, do you have any witnesses to present in your defense?" Judge Thatcher asked, and there was a note of finality in his voice, as if the outcome had already been decided. "Yes, Your Honor," Peter Grant said, standing quickly. "We call Ryder Ross to the stand." Judge Thatcher's eyebrows rose. "I am not familiar with that name. Who is this person, and what relevance could he possibly have to these charges?" "Mr. Ross has information pertinent to this case, Your Honor," Peter said, and though his voice shook slightly, he did not back down. Ryder walked to the witness stand and placed his hand on the Bible to be sworn in. His expression was calm, but Susannah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set with determination. "Mr. Ross, please state your occupation," Peter Grant said. "I am a ranch hand, currently employed at the Triple Bar Ranch," Ryder said. "Before that, I worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, and before that, I worked on my family's ranch in Colorado until we lost it." "And how did you lose your family's ranch?" Peter asked. Luther Haynes surged to his feet. "Objection. This has nothing to do with the charges against Miss Morrison." "Your Honor, I assure you this is directly relevant," Peter said quickly. Judge Thatcher looked annoyed, but he waved his hand dismissively. "Make your point quickly, Mr. Grant, or I will sustain the objection." "Mr. Ross, how did you lose your family's ranch?" Peter repeated. "A man named James Kirkland wanted our land," Ryder said, his voice even but his eyes hard. "He brought false charges against my father, just like Mr. Haynes has done to Miss Morrison. And when my father could not afford to fight back in court, he lost everything. The experience taught me to recognize corruption when I see it." "Objection," Luther Haynes roared. "This is slander, Your Honor. I demand this witness be removed." But something had shifted in the courtroom. People were leaning forward now, listening intently, and Susannah could see questions forming on their faces. "Mr. Ross," Peter Grant said, speaking quickly before the judge could rule, "in your time in Wheatland, have you observed anything that suggests Judge Thatcher might not be impartial in cases involving Mr. Haynes?" "Your Honor, this is outrageous," Luther Haynes shouted. But Ryder was already speaking, his voice cutting through the commotion like a knife. "I have heard from multiple sources that Judge Thatcher demands payment to rule favorably in cases before his court. I have heard that he threatened Miss Morrison yesterday in his private chambers, telling her she needed to pay him $2,000 or he would rule against her today." The courtroom exploded into chaos. People were shouting, some in disbelief, some in anger, some in recognition because they had suspected the truth all along but had never dared speak it aloud. Judge Thatcher was banging his gavel furiously, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "That is a lie," he bellowed. "I demand this man be arrested for perjury and contempt." "It is not a lie," came a voice from the back of the courtroom, and Tom Bellamy stood up, his expression grim. Judge Thatcher demanded $300 from me last year to drop charges against me. Charges that were false, just like these ones against Miss Morrison. He took $500 from me when I tried to keep custody of my children, Mrs. Patterson called out, standing as well. He said if I did not pay, he would declare me an unfit mother. More voices joined in. A chorus of accusations and confessions. People who had been silent for years suddenly finding their courage now that they were not alone. The courtroom was in complete uproar, and Judge Thatcher looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting from face to face as he realized his carefully constructed web of corruption was unraveling before his eyes. "Order!" he shouted, slamming his gavel down so hard it cracked. "I will have order in this courtroom." But no one was listening anymore. And then Ryder spoke again, his voice somehow carrying over the din. "I have one more thing to say," he announced, and the room gradually quieted, everyone straining to hear. "Yesterday afternoon, I spoke with a gentleman in the saloon, a lawyer from Cheyenne who happened to be passing through Wheatland. He was very interested to hear about Judge Thatcher's activities, and he has already sent word to the territorial governor requesting an investigation into corruption in this court." Judge Thatcher went very still, the color draining from his face. "You are lying," he said, but his voice had lost its thunder. "I am not," Ryder said calmly. "In fact, I believe that lawyer is in this courtroom right now." A man in a fine suit stood up near the back, and Susannah recognized him as someone she had seen at the boarding house the night before. "Arthur Caldwell, representing the territorial governor's office," he said crisply. "And I can confirm that everything Mr. Ross has said is accurate. An investigation has been opened, and I will be remaining in Wheatland to take statements from anyone who has information about judicial corruption." The silence that fell over the courtroom was absolute. Judge Thatcher stared at Arthur Caldwell like he was seeing a ghost, and all the bluster and authority drained out of him like water from a cracked barrel. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then seemed to collapse in on himself. Luther Haynes had gone very pale. He looked at Judge Thatcher, then at Ryder, then at Susannah, and she saw the moment he realized he had lost. Without the judge in his pocket, without the power to manipulate the courts, he was just another rancher with a bad reputation and a history of trying to steal from his neighbors. "This case is dismissed," Judge Thatcher said hoarsely. "Miss Morrison, you are free to go." But Arthur Caldwell was already speaking again. "Judge Cornelius Thatcher, you are hereby relieved of your duties pending a full investigation into allegations of bribery, extortion, and obstruction of justice. I suggest you cooperate fully if you have any hope of avoiding criminal charges yourself." The courtroom erupted again, but this time it was different. People were cheering, clapping, shouting Susannah's name. She stood frozen in shock, unable to quite believe what had just happened. It had worked. Ryder's plan had actually worked. She was free. Her ranch was safe. And Judge Thatcher's reign of corruption was over. She turned and found Ryder pushing through the crowd toward her, his gray eyes bright with triumph. When he reached her, she did not think, did not hesitate. She threw her arms around his neck and held on tight, feeling his arms come up to wrap around her waist, solid and strong and real. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice choked with tears she could not hold back any longer. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "You are welcome," Ryder murmured, and she felt him press his face into her hair for just a moment. "You were so brave in there, Susannah, so damn brave." They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped around each other in the middle of the chaotic courtroom, and Susannah felt something click into place in her chest. Something warm and right and terrifying in its intensity. She pulled back just enough to look up at Ryder's face, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "Come back to the ranch with me," she said impulsively. "Let me make you dinner. Let me thank you properly." Ryder smiled, a real smile that lit up his whole face and made him look younger, happier. "I would like that," he said. They rode out to the Morrison ranch together, leaving the chaos of the courthouse behind. The afternoon sun was brutal, but Susannah barely felt it. She kept looking over at Ryder as they rode, hardly believing he was real, hardly believing any of this was real. The ranch looked exactly as she had left it that morning, the small wooden house with its wide porch, the barn that needed new paint, the corrals where her cattle grazed peacefully. It was not much compared to the sprawling spreads owned by men like Luther Haynes, but it was hers, bought with honest work and maintained with stubborn pride, and she loved every sun-bleached board of it. "It is beautiful," Ryder said as they dismounted, and he sounded like he meant it. "It needs work," Susannah admitted, leading him toward the house. "The roof leaks when it rains hard and the barn door does not close properly, and I have been meaning to fix the fence on the east pasture for 6 months now." "Sounds like you could use an extra pair of hands," Ryder said casually, but there was something careful in his tone, like he was testing the waters. Susannah paused with her hand on the door, her heart suddenly racing. "Is that an offer?" "Depends," Ryder said, stepping closer. He was near enough now that she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, could smell the scent of leather and soap and something uniquely him. "Would you want me to stay?" It was too fast. They barely knew each other. 24 hours ago, she had never even heard his name. But Susannah had learned through hard experience that life in the Wild West did not give you the luxury of waiting for the perfect moment. You had to grab hold of good things when they came along, because they might not come again. "Yes," she said simply. "I would want that very much." Ryder's face transformed with another one of those beautiful smiles. "Then I am staying," he said, "for as long as you will have me." Susannah felt answering smile spreading across her own face, so wide it made her cheeks ache. "You might regret that. I am told I can be quite stubborn." "Good," Ryder said. "I like stubborn." They went inside, and Susannah set about making dinner while Ryder washed up at the pump outside. Her hands were shaking with nerves and excitement, and the aftermath of everything that had happened. But she managed to pull together a respectable meal of fried chicken, biscuits, and green beans from her garden. It was nothing fancy, but Ryder ate like it was a feast, complimenting everything and asking for seconds. They talked as they ate, sharing stories about their lives. Ryder told her about growing up in Colorado, about losing his parents and spending years drifting from town to town, never staying anywhere long because every place reminded him of what he had lost. Susannah told him about her father's dream of building something lasting, about her mother's gentle strength, about the loneliness of being the only woman rancher in a territory full of men who thought she should give up and go back east where she belonged. "You proved them wrong," Ryder said softly. "You are still here, still fighting. That takes more courage than most men I know could manage." "I had helped today," Susannah pointed out. "If you had not come along." "You would have found another way," Ryder interrupted. "You are a survivor, Susannah Morrison. I could see that the moment I met you." The way he said her name made something flutter in Susannah's chest. She stood to clear the plates, suddenly needing something to do with her hands, but Ryder stood too and caught her wrist gently. "Leave them," he said. "Come sit with me on the porch. It is too nice an evening to spend inside." They sat on the porch steps as the sun began to set, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. The air was finally cooling and a breeze rustled through the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called lonely and wild. "I meant what I said earlier," Ryder said after a long, comfortable silence. "About staying. I know it is sudden and I know you do not really know me yet, but I would like the chance to change that. I would like to help you fix up this ranch, help you build it into something even better than what your father dreamed." "Why?" Susannah asked, turning to look at him. "You could work anywhere. The triple bar would probably pay you more than I can afford." "Because I am tired of drifting," Ryder said honestly. "I am tired of moving from place to place with no roots, no home, no reason to stay. And because when I saw you yesterday, standing there trying so hard to be strong even though your world was falling apart, I felt something I have not felt in years. I felt like maybe I had found a reason to stop running." Susannah's breath caught. "Ryder." "I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give," Ryder said quickly. "I know this is fast. I know you probably think I am crazy, but I believe in being honest about what I want, and what I want is a chance to see where this could go. A chance to get to know you. A chance to maybe build something together." Susannah looked at him, at this man who had walked into her life barely a day ago and turned everything upside down in the best possible way. She thought about the loneliness of the past 2 years, the bone-deep weariness of fighting every battle alone. She thought about the way her heart had leaped when Ryder had walked into that courtroom, the way his touch had sent electricity through her, the way his smile made her feel like maybe the world was not such a harsh and unforgiving place after all. "I want that too," she said, and her voice only shook a little. "I want to see where this goes. I want you to stay. And I want to get to know you, Ryder Ross, because I have a feeling you are going to be very important to me." The smile that spread across Ryder's face was like sunrise, warm and bright and full of promise. He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and this time neither of them pulled away. They sat like that until full dark fell, talking and laughing and slowly beginning to weave their lives together. And when Ryder finally stood to head back to town to collect his things from the boarding house, he paused and cupped Susannah's face gently in both hands. "Thank you for trusting me," he said softly. "I promise I will do everything I can to be worthy of it." Then he kissed her forehead, gentle and sweet, and rode off into the night, leaving Susannah standing on her porch with her heart racing and her lips curved in a smile she could not seem to wipe away. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and growing affection. Ryder proved to be as good as his word, throwing himself into the work of repairing and improving the ranch with an energy that left Susannah breathless. He fixed the leaking roof, rehung the barn door, mended the fence in the east pasture, and a dozen other tasks that Susannah had been putting off for lack of time or strength or help. But more than the physical labor, he brought life back to the ranch in ways Susannah had not expected. He sang while he worked, old cowboy ballads and trail songs that made her smile. He joked with the 2 ranch hands Susannah employed, a father and son team named Miguel and Carlos who had been loyal to her family for years. He helped Susannah plan for the fall cattle drive, offering suggestions born from years of experience on the trail. And slowly, carefully, he courted her. It was nothing dramatic or showy. Ryder was not a man for grand gestures, but he left wildflowers on her porch in the mornings. He made sure she had a cup of coffee ready when she came down for breakfast. He sat with her in the evenings and listened while she talked about her dreams for the ranch, about expanding the herd, about maybe breeding horses in addition to cattle. He told her about his own dreams, about wanting a place to belong, about building something that would last. They kissed for the first time 3 weeks after the trial, standing in the barn after they had finished the evening chores. The sun was setting, sending golden light streaming through the gaps in the walls, and Susannah had been laughing at something Ryder had said when he suddenly went very still. She looked up and found him watching her with such intensity that her laughter died in her throat. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough. Susannah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "Yes," she whispered. He kissed her slowly, tenderly, like she was something precious and fragile. His lips were warm and soft, and his hands came up to cradle her face with infinite gentleness. Susannah melted into him, her arms winding around his neck, and the kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and necessary and absolutely right. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Ryder rested his forehead against hers and laughed shakily. "I have been wanting to do that since the moment I met you," he admitted. "You should have done it sooner," Susannah said, and kissed him again. After that, the physical affection between them grew naturally, inevitably. They held hands while they walked around the ranch. They stole kisses in quiet moments. They sat close together on the porch in the evenings, Susannah's head resting on Ryder's shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the stars come out over the Wyoming plains. Miguel and Carlos teased them mercilessly but kindly, clearly delighted to see Susannah happy after so long. And when word spread through Wheatland that Ryder Ross had moved onto the Morrison ranch, there were a few raised eyebrows and whispered comments, but most people seemed to approve. After the dramatic trial and the exposure of Judge Thatcher's corruption, Susannah had become something of a local hero, and Ryder was the man who had helped her win. That bought them a considerable amount of goodwill. Judge Thatcher himself had been removed from the bench and arrested. The investigation revealed years of corruption, dozens of people he had extorted money from, and numerous lives he had ruined for profit. He would spend the next several years in prison, and Susannah felt no pity for him. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. Luther Haynes had left Wheatland entirely, selling his ranch and moving to Montana, where people had not yet heard about his attempt to steal land from a young woman through fabricated charges. Good riddance, as far as Susannah was concerned. In September, Susannah and Ryder drove her cattle to market together, joining the great trail drive that moved thousands of head north to the railroad. It was grueling, exhausting work, but Susannah had never been happier. She rode beside Ryder under the vast blue sky, slept beside him under the stars, and felt more alive than she had in years. The cattle sold well, bringing in enough money not only to sustain the ranch through the winter, but to expand. Susannah bought 20 more head and a young breeding bull that Ryder selected with a careful eye for good bloodlines. They talked about the future, about building the Morrison Ranch into one of the most successful operations in Wyoming, about making a name for themselves. But they also talked about more personal things, about marriage, about family, about building a life together that was about more than just business partnership. "I want to marry you," Ryder said one evening in early October as they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the growing chill. "I know it has not been very long, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Susannah Morrison. I love your strength and your stubbornness, and your refusal to give up even when everything seems impossible. I love the way you laugh and the way you look at the sunrise like it is a gift, and the way you care for this ranch like it is a living thing. I want to spend the rest of my life with you if you will have me." Susannah's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will marry you, Ryder Ross. I love you too. I think I have loved you since you walked into that courtroom and fought for me when no one else would. You gave me back my life, and now I want to share it with you." Ryder kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Susannah felt the last walls around her heart crumble completely. She had been alone for so long, carrying so much weight on her shoulders, and now she did not have to anymore. Now she had a partner, an equal, someone who loved her not despite her strength but because of it. They were married in November in a simple ceremony at the small church in Wheatland. Half the town turned out to celebrate, bringing food and gifts and good wishes. Tom Bellamy and Mrs. Patterson were there, along with Arthur Caldwell, who had stayed in town to oversee the installation of a new, honest judge. Miguel and Carlos stood up as witnesses, beaming with pride. Susannah wore a cream-colored dress that had belonged to her mother, carefully preserved all these years. Ryder wore a new suit that made him look almost uncomfortably formal, though Susannah thought he was the handsomest man she had ever seen. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and honor and cherish each other through whatever trials life might bring. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Ryder kissed Susannah in front of the entire congregation, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and music provided by a fiddle player and a guitar player from town. People danced and ate and drank, and Susannah felt almost dizzy with happiness. This was her family now, these people who had stood by her, who had believed in her, who had helped her fight for what was right. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Ryder pulled Susannah aside and led her to the porch. The house had been cleaned and decorated with wildflowers by some of the ladies from town, and the bedroom upstairs was waiting for them, but Ryder seemed in no hurry to rush inside. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Susannah said honestly, leaning back against him. "Thank you, Ryder, for everything, for fighting for me, for staying, for loving me." "Thank you for letting me," Ryder murmured. "You saved me just as much as I saved you. Before I met you, I was just drifting, going through the motions of living but not really alive. You gave me a reason to stop running, a reason to build something that matters. You gave me a home." Susannah turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope for the future into it. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, she took his hand and led him inside, closing the door on the world and beginning their first night as husband and wife. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle that got sick and fences that needed constant mending. There were neighbors who still thought a woman had no business running a ranch, even with a husband by her side. There were moments of doubt and frustration, and bone-deep weariness. But there was also joy, deep and abiding. The Morrison Ranch flourished under Susannah and Ryder's joint management, growing from a struggling operation into one of the most respected spreads in Wyoming. They expanded the herd, added horses as Susannah had dreamed, and built a reputation for honest dealing and quality stock. More importantly, they built a life together filled with love and laughter and partnership. They worked side by side every day, learning each other's rhythms and strengths and weaknesses. They argued sometimes because both of them were stubborn and opinionated, but they always talked it through and never went to bed angry. In the spring of 1885, Susannah discovered she was pregnant. She was 25 years old, and the news filled her with equal parts terror and overwhelming joy. Ryder was ecstatic, picking her up and spinning her around despite her protests, talking excitedly about building a cradle and adding onto the house and teaching their child to ride. Their son was born in January of 1886, a healthy, squalling baby boy with Ryder's dark hair and Susannah's green eyes. They named him Samuel, after Susannah's father, and Ryder cried when he held his son for the first time. overcome with emotion at this tiny, perfect life they had created together. Samuel was followed by a daughter 2 years later, Emily, who had her mother's stubborn streak and her father's easy laugh. And then another son, Daniel, in 1891, who was quiet and thoughtful and loved the horses more than anything. The house that had once felt too big and empty was now bursting with noise and life and love. Susannah watched her children grow, teaching them to ride and rope and care for the land, and felt a contentment so profound it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. Miguel and Carlos remained with the ranch, eventually joined by Carlos's son and then his grandson. The Morrison Ranch became known not just for its quality cattle and horses, but for being a good place to work, a place where people were treated fairly and paid honestly. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryder and Susannah rode out to the creek that had been at the center of Luther Haynes's false accusations all those years ago. The grass was thick and green, and the water ran clear and cold. They dismounted and sat on the bank, watching the sunlight dance on the ripples. "You ever think about that day in court?" Susannah asked, leaning against Ryder's shoulder. "About how different everything could have been?" "Sometimes," Ryder admitted. "But mostly I am just grateful it turned out the way it did. Grateful I was in the right place at the right time. Grateful you let me into your life." "Best decision I ever made," Susannah said, tilting her face up for a kiss. "Second best," Ryder corrected with a grin. "The best decision was standing up to Judge Thatcher in the first place. You were already brave, Susannah. I just helped you find your voice." They sat by the creek until the sun began to set, talking about everything and nothing, comfortable in the silence and in each other's presence. 10 years of marriage had only deepened their love, adding layers of understanding and shared experience that made them partners in the truest sense of the word. As they rode back to the ranch, Susannah could see the lights in the windows and knew her children were waiting, probably driving the housekeeper crazy with questions about when their parents would be home. She could hear the lowing of cattle in the distance and the whicker of horses in the corrals. She could smell wood smoke from the cookhouse and the sweet scent of hay. This was home. This was family. This was the life she had fought so hard to protect and build, and it was perfect. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and new joys. Samuel grew into a fine young man who took naturally to ranching, and eventually took over much of the day-to-day management of the Morrison spread. Emily surprised everyone by becoming fascinated with breeding horses, and developed a keen eye for good stock that rivaled her father's. Daniel became a veterinarian, the first in the family to pursue formal education, but he returned to Wyoming after his studies and set up practice in Wheatland, serving ranchers throughout the territory. Susannah and Ryder grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces weathering from years in the sun. But they never lost the spark between them, that fundamental connection that had been forged in a moment of crisis and tempered into something unbreakable through years of partnership. They became the elder statesmen of the community, respected for their integrity and their success. Young couples starting out would come to them for advice. People facing injustice would seek their counsel. And always, Susannah and Ryder would remember that day in court when one cowboy had walked in and changed everything, and they would do what they could to help others find their own courage to fight back against corruption and cruelty. Judge Thatcher died in prison in 1895, unlamented and unmourned. Luther Haynes was killed in a bar fight in Montana years earlier, his reputation for dishonesty having finally caught up with him. Susannah felt no satisfaction at their fates, only sadness that they had chosen paths that led to such bitter ends. On a warm summer evening in 1903, Susannah and Ryder sat on the porch of the house they had shared for nearly 20 years, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Samuel had married and had 3 children of his own. Emily had just announced she was expecting her first. Daniel was courting a teacher from town, and Ryder was already planning the wedding in his head. "We did good," Susannah said softly, taking Ryder's hand. "Look at all of this. Look at what we built." "You did good," Ryder corrected gently. "You were the one who refused to give up. You were the one who fought for this place when everyone said you should walk away. I just helped." "You did more than help," Susannah said firmly. "You stood beside me when no one else would. You believed in me. You loved me. And you gave me this beautiful life, this family, this home. I could not have done any of it without you, Ryder Ross." Ryder smiled and raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Then I guess we did it together," he said, "just like everything else." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and thriving, a testament to their hard work and enduring love. Their children and grandchildren filled the house with laughter and life. And Susannah Morrison Ross, the woman who had once stood alone against corruption and greed, who had fought for justice when it seemed impossible, felt a peace and happiness so complete it was almost overwhelming. She had everything she had ever dreamed of and more. She had her land, her family, and the love of a good man who had walked into her life at exactly the right moment and never left. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Susannah knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be, exactly who she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. It was a happy ending, hard-won and well-deserved, and it was real. And that made it all the sweeter.